When the blizzard of 1888 hit, it tore through the Rockies like an unstoppable beast, freezing everything in its path. But one man, standing inside his odd, metal-clad structure, watched as the storm raged, untouched and warm, while nearby cabins lay buried in snow, their inhabitants lost. How did a crazy Quonset hut survive where so many failed? Before we dive deeper into this unbelievable survival story, let us know where you're watching from. And if this tale of endurance moves you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will leave you speechless. The wind howled like a beast unleashed as the storm rolled in, swift and violent, covering the world in a blanket of snow. It was the kind of storm that no one could ignore, the kind that would test every soul in its path. In the small, isolated settlement nestled at the edge of the mountain range, people were already bracing for a battle. The blizzard was forecasted, but no one knew it would arrive with such a fury. As the first flakes fell, they seemed innocent enough, just a few sprinkles of snow. But within hours the winds picked up and the snow thickened, turning into an impenetrable wall of white. Inside a small cabin just outside town, Nathaniel Clark could feel the pressure of the storm settling in. He'd been through blizzards before, living in the Rockies for years, but nothing compared to what he could already hear howling through the trees. His cabin, a simple log structure with a tin roof, had been a refuge in previous storms, but now, as the winds battered against its walls, Nathaniel knew it wouldn't last the night. His thoughts turned quickly to his neighbors, scattered cabins across the wilderness, and the terrible reality that some of them might not make it through. Nathaniel wasn't like most settlers. He didn't rely on traditional methods of shelter. His crazy idea had led him to construct a Quonset hut, an odd shape and unfamiliar structure, but one he believed could withstand the harshest of elements. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. Made of steel and wood, the hut sat firmly against the mountainside, its curved shape meant to resist the very winds that were now tearing through the air. The roof was reinforced with metal, unlike the frail wood of a typical cabin. Nathaniel had spent years building it, pouring every ounce of his energy into the structure. No one in the settlement understood why he'd chosen such an unorthodox design, but they would soon learn the reason. As the blizzard intensified, Nathaniel stood by the window, watching the snow fall in blinding sheets, the wind so fierce it felt as though it might tear the land apart. The other cabins around him were already invisible beneath the thick snow. The wind was cutting through the trees like a knife, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Nathaniel could hear the sounds of the storm slamming into his hut, but it held firm. He smiled to himself, knowing that he was safer than the others out there. The Quonset hut wasn't just a shelter, it was a lifeline. He glanced at his fire, the warmth filling the small room as he pulled a thick woolen blanket around his shoulders. In his mind he could hear the whispers of doubt from his neighbors. "He's crazy, that one. That hut's nothing but trouble." But as the snow piled up outside, Nathaniel's confidence only grew. He knew he'd done the right thing. What they saw as eccentricity, he saw as survival. And now, with the storm settling in for the long haul, Nathaniel could only hope that his faith in the Quonset hut would be enough to get him through the worst blizzard the mountains had ever known. By the second day, the storm was no longer a mere disturbance. It was an all-consuming force, relentless in its fury. Nathaniel had long since stopped hearing the sounds of the other cabins. His world had narrowed to the small circle of warmth in his hut and the howling winds outside. For now he was safe. But there was a question that kept gnawing at him, a question that had started to form the moment he realized the severity of the storm. Could anyone else survive this? The mountain was a harsh place, and the settlers were hardy, but even the strongest could be brought to their knees by nature's wrath. Nathaniel had seen it happen before. People who had believed they could brave the elements, only to be undone by a single mistake. A broken axe, a misjudged step on the ice, a fire that burned out too soon. It wasn't long before Nathaniel's concern turned to action. He couldn't sit idle, knowing that the storm was claiming its victims. The winds were now so fierce that it was impossible to see beyond the threshold of his hut, but Nathaniel had built the shelter to be navigated even in the worst of storms. He knew the layout of the land, the trails that wound through the trees, and where the nearby cabin stood. But even so, he hesitated. There were risks involved. The storm was too intense, too unpredictable. If he left the safety of the hut, he might never make it back. Still, the thought of his neighbors, some of whom were elderly, others with young children, lingered in his mind. The Quonset hut had been built with their survival in mind, after all. Perhaps now was the time to put its strength to the test. He knew he had to try. Nathaniel pulled on his thickest coat, tucked his rifle into his belt, and strapped on his boots. He would check on them just to make sure they were holding up. He'd learned long ago that a good neighbor was the one who took action when the world seemed to be falling apart. The door of the hut opened with a groan, and Nathaniel stepped out into the bitter cold. Immediately, the winds hit him, knocking the breath from his chest. The snow whipped against his face, making it hard to keep his eyes open. He gritted his teeth, fighting the chill as he moved across the frozen ground, making his way toward the nearest cabin. The world around him had turned into a monochromatic blur: white snow, gray sky, and the occasional dark shape of a distant tree. It felt as though the storm had swallowed everything whole, leaving only him to stand against its might. As he reached the cabin, he knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried again, louder this time, his fists pounding against the wood. He waited, feeling the cold sink deeper into his bones. Still, no answer. The cabin was empty. A sense of dread crept up his spine, but he pushed it down. The settlers had been here long enough to know what to do in a storm. They would have gathered their supplies and hunkered down, but still, something felt off. With his heart pounding, Nathaniel turned to leave, but just then a faint sound carried over the wind, a cry for help. His heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the direction of the creek. He hesitated only for a moment before setting off toward the sound. In the distance, the blizzard roared like an angry beast, but Nathaniel had made his decision. The storm was fierce, but he wouldn't let it claim his neighbors without a fight. The Quonset hut had given him a promise of safety. Now, he would see if that promise could extend beyond its walls. The snow was waist-deep, and the wind whipped with ferocious intensity. Each step Nathaniel took felt like a battle against the very elements that were determined to tear him apart. The storm's rage blurred everything around him, making it nearly impossible to see even a few feet in front of him. The landscape, usually a familiar maze of trees and trails, had become a wasteland of white and wind, erasing all traces of the world he knew. Nathaniel's thoughts raced as he pushed forward, his breath visible in the frozen air. The cry he had heard earlier still echoed in his mind, like a beacon cutting through the chaos. Whoever it was, they needed help, but the storm was so thick now it could swallow them whole in an instant. He pulled his coat tighter around his body, squinting into the wind, trying to make out anything in the swirling snow. The creek wasn't far from his cabin, but in these conditions it felt like miles. He forced himself to focus on his breathing, one foot in front of the other, keeping a steady pace, even though the wind kept pushing him backward. The longer he spent in the storm, the more he realized how little he could trust his senses. The direction seemed to shift every few moments, and the wind howled louder, making it harder and harder to hear the faint sounds of life he had hoped for. As Nathaniel trudged through the snow, his mind couldn't help but return to the Quonset hut. It was the only structure in the settlement that was built to withstand this kind of onslaught. He had designed it with the intention of surviving harsh winters like this one, and now, standing out in the heart of the blizzard, he felt a strange sense of pride. The hut had withstood every test nature had thrown at it, and even as the storm roared, he knew it was still standing strong, a beacon of resilience in a world of uncertainty. But as proud as he was of the shelter he'd built, Nathaniel knew it couldn't save everyone. Not all the settlers had his foresight or resources. And now, as the storm continued its unrelenting fury, he was forced to confront the terrifying reality that some might not make it through. The thought twisted his gut. The wind howled again, louder this time, drowning out the world. Nathaniel squinted, trying to focus through the storm. The sound of rushing water suddenly reached his ears, sharp and quick. He was nearing the creek. For a moment he felt relief, but it was short-lived. He spotted a shadow ahead, someone standing still in the thick of the blizzard. His heart leaped. Was it one of his neighbors? A faint cry reached him again, distant, but unmistakable. He pushed on, his heart racing. The storm was closing in, but he was so close now, just a little farther. As he neared the creek's edge, he could finally make out the figure, slumped, struggling to stand. It was Rachel, the widow who lived alone with her young son. Her face was pale, her lips blue from the cold. Nathaniel's heart pounded. She was barely conscious, barely holding on. He reached her side in an instant, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her close. Her weight felt like dead weight against him, but he didn't let go. The cold had already set in, and the longer she had been exposed, the harder it would be to save her. "Rachel!" he shouted, his voice hoarse against the wind. "We need to get you back to shelter." She didn't respond, her body limp against him. Panic clawed at Nathaniel's chest, but he fought it down. He couldn't afford fear. He had to act, had to get her out of this storm. His hut, his Quonset hut, was his only chance. But it was still a good distance away, and the storm was far from letting up. There was no time to waste. Nathaniel took a deep breath, gathering the strength he needed to carry Rachel back. He adjusted her in his arms, keeping her warm against his chest as he started back toward the hut, his steps slower but steady, determined not to let the storm claim another victim. Nathaniel's muscles screamed with each step, the weight of Rachel's body dragging him down. The snow around them seemed endless, a sea of white that stretched into the horizon, the wind cutting at his exposed skin like thousands of tiny knives. But he couldn't stop. The thought of leaving her out here in the storm was worse than facing the fury of the blizzard itself. As they made their way back toward the Quonset hut, the howling wind seemed to grow louder, the snow heavier. The further they went, the more impossible it felt to keep moving. Nathaniel's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest aching as he struggled to keep both himself and Rachel alive. But the storm was relentless, pushing against him with all the fury it could muster. He looked around, squinting into the blizzard, hoping to see the outline of the hut in the distance. But the storm was so thick that it swallowed everything in its path. All he could see was the white swirling chaos. His heart sank as he realized he couldn't rely on sight. He had to rely on his instincts, on the small landmarks he had memorized over the years. It felt like every step took them further into the unknown, but Rachel's limp body was a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. He had to get her to safety. He couldn't lose another person, not after all the work he had put into making sure this hut would stand the test of time. He couldn't let it fail now. The wind whipped around them again, colder than ever. Nathaniel could feel the numbness creeping into his fingers, and it was becoming harder to grip Rachel's body, but he couldn't let go. He couldn't give up now. The storm raged on, but in his mind, Nathaniel could hear the faint sound of the hut's roof creaking against the wind, the sound of safety, the sound of survival. The Quonset hut, his crazy idea, was waiting. And Nathaniel knew, with everything in him, that it was the only chance he had left to save them both. He pushed forward, determined, as the world around him seemed to spin out of control. Every step was a battle, but somehow they were moving closer. And with every inch, the promise of warmth and safety drew nearer. The Quonset hut loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the swirling white chaos. Nathaniel's heart surged with the sight of it, though every step felt like an eternity. His legs burned with exhaustion, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. But with each step, the vision of safety, of warmth, drove him forward. Rachel's weight in his arms was growing heavier, and her limp body had gone completely still. His thoughts raced. He could feel the storm wrapping its icy fingers around him, trying to pull him back into the merciless wilderness. But the Quonset hut was within reach now, its rounded, steel-clad roof cutting through the storm like a beacon in the dark. If they could just get inside, if they could just make it to that small circle of warmth, they would survive. He had to believe that. He had no choice. The wind seemed to howl louder, more ferociously than ever, but Nathaniel pushed through, knowing that every second counted. He glanced at Rachel again. Her face was pale, lips tinged with blue, her eyes barely open, but her breath was slow, shallow. She was still alive. And that was all that mattered. He couldn't stop now, not when there was still a chance. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pulled open the heavy door of the hut. The sudden shift from the freezing world outside to the warmth within was almost too much for Nathaniel to bear. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. The warmth felt like a physical embrace, a lifeline. He stepped inside and carefully laid Rachel down on the thick woolen rug by the fire. The hut was small, but it was enough. Nathaniel had designed it to be compact, but every inch had been crafted for survival. There was a wood stove in the corner, its pipe running up through the ceiling, releasing the heat that had kept him alive in this brutal storm. His shelves were lined with supplies, dried meats, grains, and salted fish, everything he needed to wait out the storm. And it wasn't just the materials he had chosen that made it a safe haven, it was the structure itself. The hut was built for endurance. The curved steel roof and reinforced walls created a cocoon, keeping the worst of the storm at bay. Nathaniel quickly stoked the fire, adding logs, and grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the pile. He draped it over Rachel, but as he did, he realized he couldn't just sit here and wait. He had to do more. He had to keep her alive. He took a deep breath and then knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her chest rose and fell, though it was barely noticeable. He didn't know how much longer she could hold on, but the Quonset hut was his only hope, their only hope. He set to work, stoking the fire again, and then pulling out his medical kit from the shelf. It was a simple one, bandages, some salves, and tinctures. But he'd learned a lot in the mountains about treating the body with what was available. His hands moved quickly, applying the warmth from the fire to Rachel's cold limbs, rubbing them gently, trying to revive the circulation. He whispered to her as he worked, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "It's going to be all right," he murmured. "You're safe now. You'll be all right." The storm continued to howl outside, but Nathaniel didn't notice. His world had narrowed to the soft crackling of the fire, the rhythmic pulse of Rachel's breathing, and the warmth that enveloped them both. Inside the Quonset hut, they were safe. For now, that was enough. By the time Nathaniel had managed to get Rachel warm enough to stir slightly, the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. The howling winds had grown even more violent, their shrieks rattling the hut's steel frame, but inside Nathaniel and Rachel remained safe, for the moment. The fire was roaring, crackling in the stove, but as Nathaniel moved around the small space preparing a meal of heated broth and salted meat, a sinking feeling began to settle in his chest. It wasn't the storm that worried him, nor the exhaustion gnawing at his bones. It was the realization that his shelter, as sturdy and reliable as it had proven to be, wouldn't be enough for everyone. Not everyone had a Quonset hut, and as the storm raged, Nathaniel couldn't shake the thought of his neighbors, still stranded in their log cabins or worse, out there in the wilderness, fighting for survival. He glanced at Rachel, still unconscious, but showing signs of life. Her cheeks had flushed a healthy red, and her breathing was less labored. She was coming back to him, but the toll of the storm had been too much. How long had she been out there, exposed to the elements? How many others might still be out there, fighting to survive? Nathaniel's thoughts raced, his mind turning over every possible solution. There were no other Quonset huts in the settlement, No one else had thought to build something as resilient, as foolhardy as his design. The traditional log cabins, sturdy though they were in calmer weather, were no match for a storm like this. Nathaniel had built his shelter as a safeguard against the very thing that was now tearing the world apart, the blizzard of 1888. The storm had been predicted to be fierce, but no one had truly prepared for the devastation it would unleash. And now here he was, one man with one hut, and the rest of the settlement scattered around him, vulnerable and exposed. There was nothing he could do for them now, not in the middle of the storm. It was too dangerous to leave Rachel again, not when she was so close to recovery. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake twice. But the guilt settled deep, like a weight on his chest. He knew he had done all he could for himself, but as the storm grew fiercer, he realized just how fragile their lives were in this unforgiving wilderness. Even the strongest structures could be undone by nature's wrath. What good was survival if it was at the cost of so many others? Nathaniel could feel the burden of the others' safety bearing down on him. With a sigh, he stepped away from Rachel's side, gazing at the cold storm through the small window. The wind rattled the steel of the hut, but it remained unyielding. Nathaniel knew that, for now, his place in the world was here. The Quonset hut was his home, but outside these walls there were others, countless others, fighting for their lives against the storm that seemed intent on taking everything. Nathaniel turned away from the window, resolving to keep his focus on Rachel, on surviving the night. But the question lingered. Could he, should he, leave the safety of his hut again once the storm calmed? The answer would come when the winds died down and the snow settled. Until then, he would wait. And hope. The storm raged on through the night, its fury unrelenting. Nathaniel barely slept, his body aching from the cold, but his mind was more restless than his muscles. He kept checking on Rachel, monitoring her shallow breaths and ensuring the fire never died out. Her color had returned somewhat, but the storm was still outside, far too dangerous to venture into. The small shelter of the Quonset hut felt more like a fortress now, its metallic walls and heavy, sturdy frame providing security where none existed outside. The wind howled and whipped the steel, making it groan with every gust. The strange sounds were oddly comforting, a constant reminder that Nathaniel was not alone, that the storm, though powerful, could not break through the strength of his shelter. The rhythmic crackle of the fire and the deep echoing howls of the storm became the backdrop to a night full of reflection and worry. Rachel stirred for a moment, and Nathaniel paused in his movement. Her eyelids fluttered and her lips parted, but she didn't wake. He sat beside her, placing a hand on her forehead, feeling the warmth from her recovery. Still, worry gnawed at him. She'd been through so much, and even with the fire roaring and the safety of the hut, the storm seemed like it could tear it all apart. The silence between the howls of the storm was deafening. Nathaniel's thoughts drifted to his neighbors, his friends, the people who lived on the fringes of the wilderness, the ones who didn't have the foresight or the resources to build anything more than a typical log cabin. Those who had lived their lives in the shadow of the mountains, trusting in the old ways, in the wooden cabins they'd built with their own hands. He thought of the elderly couple who lived a few miles from him, the young family down by the creek, the father and his son who worked the fur trade together. They were all exposed to the blizzard now, and Nathaniel knew, as the hours dragged on, that there wasn't enough time for him to save them all. The storm was growing more vicious with each passing hour. He couldn't even see the other cabins from where he stood, and any attempt to venture out into the whiteout would be futile. The storm had erased everything. It was just Nathaniel and Rachel in the warmth of the Quonset hut, surrounded by the encroaching nothingness outside. Nathaniel sat with Rachel in the quiet, his hand still resting on her chest. He could feel her heartbeat, steady and slow, like the pulse of the world outside, still alive, even amidst the chaos. Her recovery brought him some comfort, but it didn't erase the growing guilt in the pit of his stomach. As the night wore on, Nathaniel let his mind wander to his own path. Why he had built the Quonset hut in the first place. At first it had seemed like a quirky idea, an eccentric choice driven by a desire for something different. But now, as the storm showed no mercy, Nathaniel realized just how much foresight had gone into his plan. His hut was holding strong. It was the difference between survival and death. The winds howled louder. Outside, the world remained swallowed in snow and white noise. But inside, Nathaniel and Rachel were, for the moment, untouched. When morning arrived, it came silently, a pale light seeping through the steel frame of the Quonset hut. The blizzard had not let up. The storm's howl had shifted to a mournful moan, but the fury was still there, raw and unyielding. Nathaniel had never felt so isolated, not even in his darkest days in the mountains. The snow outside was deep, the world transformed into a featureless expanse of white. The visibility was nearly zero. Nathaniel rose quietly, from his position beside Rachel, feeling the weight of the silence around him. The fire had died down overnight, its embers still glowing faintly. He threw another log on the fire, watching as it sparked and crackled to life, the warmth spreading through the room. Rachel's steady breathing was the only sound besides the fire's crackle and the distant storm. The night had passed in fits of restless sleep for Nathaniel. His body was stiff from the cold, but his mind was weighed down by more than exhaustion. The storm outside wasn't just a challenge, it was a test. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold up. Rachel stirred again, this time more awake, and Nathaniel quickly turned his attention back to her. Her eyes flickered open, confusion clouding her face for a moment. She looked around, the realization of where she was slowly sinking in. The warmth of the hut, the fire, the thick woolen blankets, they were all a relief, but they weren't enough to erase the reality of what had happened. Where are we?" Her voice was weak, but it carried the edge of concern. "We're safe," Nathaniel said softly, sitting next to her. "You're inside, the Quonset hut. We're out of the storm." Rachel's eyes searched his face, a flicker of recognition. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "The storm? It's still raging, but we're all right for now." He looked down at her, unable to hide the worry in his own eyes. "You've been through a lot. Rest." Rachel's gaze moved past him, toward the window where the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. The world outside veiled in the same unyielding white. "How long?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How long until it stops?" Nathaniel glanced out the small window, but the question gnawed at him. How long indeed? He didn't have an answer. The storm had already been going for over 24 hours. Would it let up today, tomorrow, or would it continue as relentless and unforgiving as the mountains themselves? He didn't know, but as Rachel's weak smile faded, Nathaniel knew the storm wasn't just outside. It was inside too, in the form of doubt. The longer the storm lasted, the harder it would be to survive. Even his Quonset hut, sturdy as it was, wouldn't be enough forever. The questions loomed larger than the storm itself. How long could they hold out? How many others were out there, struggling to survive? The Quonset hut, as strong and reliable as it had been, had never promised anything more than shelter. And as Nathaniel sat beside Rachel, the weight of the storm outside, the loneliness, and the uncertainty of the days ahead pressed heavily on him. The Quonset hut might save them for now, but could it save them long enough? As the day stretched into a second, then a third, Nathaniel grew more restless with each passing hour. The storm outside had not relented, and the world beyond the Quonset hut remained a swirling, violent mass of white. The winds didn't stop. They just howled louder, pushing against the shelter in a constant rhythm, like the breath of some enormous beast just outside their walls. The sounds of the storm were growing familiar, almost like a second heartbeat. But the serenity of being inside the hut was slipping away as the isolation began to settle in. Rachel, though recovering from the worst of the storm's grip, was still weak. She had been mostly silent for the past few hours, drifting in and out of awareness. Nathaniel kept his distance, giving her space to rest, but he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the weight of what was happening inside his mind. The Quonset hut was holding strong, that much was certain. But the real danger, Nathaniel realized, wasn't the storm outside, it was the uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. They had food and warmth. They had shelter. For now, that was enough. But it wasn't going to be enough forever. Outside, his neighbors, those who had lived so close to him, some of them just a few miles away, were still out there, at the mercy of the blizzard. Nathaniel had been so focused on the immediate survival of Rachel that he had pushed away the mounting guilt that continued to grow. What if the storm didn't stop? What if they couldn't wait it out in isolation for much longer? The thought of venturing out into the storm again filled him with dread. His Quonset hut, sturdy as it was, wasn't an open invitation for the world to come seeking shelter. Even if he managed to make it through the storm, even if the others survived, the chances of finding anyone in these conditions were slim at best. His neighbors didn't have the advantage he had: the shelter, the warmth, the strategic location of the hut. He had everything on his side, but he wasn't sure it was enough to save everyone. Nathaniel's mind was a battlefield torn between duty and survival, the drive to protect those he cared for, and the recognition that his own safety had to come first if he was to help anyone at all. He wasn't sure how much longer Rachel would stay unconscious. Every minute mattered. Every second was a fight for life. But even that thought, as much as it was about survival, didn't sit well with him. Shouldn't he do more? Shouldn't he try to help his neighbors? The guilt gnawed at his insides. He walked toward the stove, stoking the fire again, the crackling sound filling the space as he did. The warmth from the flames offered some comfort, but it didn't ease the weight of what was becoming an inevitable choice. What would happen when Rachel woke up? She was strong, but would she be strong enough to survive the storm outside? What if there was more than just her life to protect? Nathaniel's gaze shifted toward the window again, his thoughts clouded by doubt. He couldn't make the decision yet, but something in his gut told him the moment would soon come when he would have to leave the hut. The storm wasn't going to let up, he knew that much, and when it did, would anyone be left to rescue? By the fourth day, the blizzard had not waned. The howling winds continued to push against the Quonset hut, rattling the steel frame as if trying to break through. Nathaniel had been keeping watch over Rachel, constantly checking her temperature, making sure the fire didn't go out. The storm outside had become a constant companion, a maddening reminder of the world that still existed beyond the shelter's walls. But as the hours dragged on, the feeling of isolation began to press against Nathaniel in ways he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't stay here forever, cocooned in the warmth and safety of the hut, while the storm outside claimed so much more. The truth was undeniable. His neighbors were out there, struggling, fighting for their lives just as Rachel had. Nathaniel had never been one to leave others behind, but it wasn't just about helping them. It was about the impossible choice that loomed over him. He couldn't carry the weight of their survival alone, yet he knew that if he didn't try, he would never forgive himself. Rachel had begun to stir more frequently, her breathing steadier. She wasn't fully awake, but she was no longer on the brink of death. The color had returned to her cheeks, and there was warmth in her limbs that hadn't been there before, but there was still a look of confusion in her eyes, a fogginess from the ordeal. It would be only a matter of time before she asked the inevitable question, what happens now? Nathaniel didn't know the answer, but he had made his decision. He could no longer sit idle, waiting for the storm to end on its own. The storm had already claimed so much, and he had to act before it took even more. He couldn't keep hiding inside the safety of his hut. Even if the storm outside had no intention of stopping, there were others out there who might still be alive, and Nathaniel couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to help. With a heavy heart, Nathaniel turned away from the stove and moved toward the bed where Rachel lay. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, she seemed aware of her surroundings. "You're safe," Nathaniel whispered, kneeling beside her. "The storm's still going, but we're warm. We're okay." Rachel's lips parted, and she weakly nodded, her eyes still cloudy with confusion. Where's everyone else?" The question hit Nathaniel like a wave. He swallowed hard, the words difficult to form. "They're out there, in the storm," he said softly. "I'm going to help them." Rachel looked at him, concern flickering in her eyes. "You can't. It's too dangerous. The storm—" "I have to try," he said, cutting her off gently. "I can't just sit here while they're out there. I have to try, Rachel. I can't let this storm claim anyone else." Rachel tried to sit up, but her body was still weak. "You'll never make it. It's too far, too much." Nathaniel shook his head. "I have to. I'll come back. I'll make it back." As he stood and made his way toward the door, a part of him knew the risks. He couldn't promise anything. He wasn't sure how long the storm would last, or if anyone was still alive out there. But he couldn't stay here, in the safety of the hut, knowing that others were fighting to survive in the same storm that had almost killed Rachel. The door creaked as Nathaniel stepped out into the snow, the cold wind immediately biting at his face. The storm raged on, but Nathaniel wasn't turning back. Not this time. His footsteps were swallowed by the endless white expanse, but he kept moving, driven by the call to action, the duty to help those who couldn't help themselves. Nathaniel's boots sank deep into the snow as he trudged through the swirling storm, his breath coming in harsh, visible puffs. The wind howled around him, the snow stinging his face, but he didn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest with both fear and determination. Each step was a struggle against nature's fury, but he had no choice. He couldn't stay inside, safe and warm, while others were still out there, battling for their lives. The Quonset hut, as sturdy as it was, felt like a distant memory now. It was a sanctuary in the middle of the chaos, but the world outside was unforgiving. The storm was relentless, a living, breathing monster that showed no mercy. Nathaniel could barely see his hand in front of his face, let alone the landmarks that would guide him to the cabins. Every few moments he had to pause, squinting through the whiteout, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would tell him where he was. The wind whipped around him, and Nathaniel pulled his scarf tighter, trying to shield his face from the bitter cold. He had no idea how far he would need to go. The others might be scattered, too far to reach in a single day. But he couldn't stop now. He had made a promise to himself, to Rachel, and to his neighbors. He would help them if it was the last thing he did. As he walked, the eerie silence between the howling gusts began to weigh on him. The storm wasn't just cold. It was suffocating, closing in on him. It wasn't just the threat of the weather he had to face. It was the uncertainty of whether anyone would even be there when he arrived. Was it too late? Had the storm already claimed them? Nathaniel pushed the thought aside. He couldn't let himself entertain doubt. He had to keep moving, one step at a time, toward what he hoped was a rescue. The further he ventured, the harder it became to distinguish the landscape. The trees around him were nothing more than indistinct shadows, their branches bent under the weight of the snow. The path, which had once been familiar, was now lost in the storm. There was no telling which direction he was headed, but he had memorized the routes well enough to know that if he kept heading northeast, he would eventually come across the first cabin. But the storm was not only erasing his sense of direction, it was erasing the hope he had once felt. His muscles were sore, and his face was raw from the constant onslaught of snow and wind. Every inch he moved forward felt like a victory, but with each step his body grew more fatigued. Then, just as he felt the cold begin to numb his limbs, he spotted something. A faint outline barely discernible through the haze. A cabin. His heart surged with relief, but it was short-lived. The cabin was surrounded by snowdrifts, and there was no sign of life. Nathaniel's stomach twisted as he approached, his mind racing. Could they be inside? He hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. Was he too late? His instincts kicked in. He pushed the door open with force, the wood creaking in protest against the weight of the storm. Inside, there was no one. The cabin had been abandoned in haste, the hearth cold, and the remnants of a half-eaten meal left on the table. Nathaniel's heart sank. They had gone, or worse, they had fallen victim to the storm. The thought was unbearable. But there was no time for grief. He had to move on, had to find the others, or at least try. He stepped back outside, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. Nathaniel's breath came in sharp bursts, his body trembling from the bitter cold. He had been walking for hours, his pace slowing with every step, but the storm was showing no signs of easing. His muscles were sore, his feet numb, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't go back without at least knowing he had tried. The cabin he had just searched was empty, its inhabitants long gone or worse. His mind replayed the image of the abandoned home, the untouched meal on the table, the dust on the floor. They had fled, or they hadn't survived. Either way, the storm had taken its toll, but he couldn't stop there. There were still other cabins, still other neighbors who needed help. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone else facing this storm alone, unable to escape its grasp. Every instinct in him told him to press on, but his body was beginning to fail him. His steps grew slower, the cold creeping deeper into his bones. Nathaniel paused for a moment, leaning against a snow-covered tree. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He was exhausted. The cold, the wind, the isolation. It was all too much. His body was beginning to shut down, but he couldn't give in. Not yet. Not when he was this close. The storm seemed to be growing louder, as if nature itself was mocking him. The snow stung his skin, his eyes watering with each gust of wind. He could barely see anything beyond the immediate surroundings, the white wall of snow and ice surrounding him. The world felt impossibly small, swallowed by the blizzard. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the wind, a faint cry for help. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. His ears strained to catch the sound again, but the wind howled relentlessly, drowning out everything else. He wasn't sure if he had heard it or if his mind was playing tricks on him, but it didn't matter. He had to find them, whoever it was. He had to find a way to help. With renewed determination, Nathaniel pushed forward, his legs heavy with fatigue, but his heart light with the glimmer of hope. The storm had already taken so much, but as long as he could hear that cry, as long as there was a chance, he would keep fighting. He stumbled through the snow, his mind focused on the sound he had heard, hoping it wasn't a figment of his imagination. With each step, he thought he was getting closer, but the blizzard made it nearly impossible to tell. The world had become a blur of white, the line between earth and sky indistinguishable. Minutes felt like hours. He pushed through, step by step, the sound of the wind howling louder in his ears. His body was screaming for rest, but his resolve was stronger. He could make it. He had to. And then, through the fog of snow and wind, he saw something, a figure, a shadow against the storm. His heart raced as he stumbled forward, calling out, "Hello?" His voice barely reached over the roar of the wind, but it didn't matter. He was close. The figure was still there, and for the first time in days, Nathaniel felt a spark of hope. He was going to make it. Nathaniel's boots sank deep into the snow as he trudged through the swirling storm, his breath coming in harsh, visible puffs. The wind howled around him, the snow stinging his face. But he didn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest with both fear and determination. Each step was a struggle against nature's fury, but he had no choice. He couldn't stay inside, safe and warm, while others were still out there, battling for their lives. The Quonset hut, as sturdy as it was, felt like a distant memory now. It was a sanctuary in the middle of the chaos. But the world outside was unforgiving. The storm was relentless, a living, breathing monster that showed no mercy. Nathaniel could barely see his hand in front of his face, let alone the landmarks that would guide him to the cabins. Every few moments he had to pause, squinting through the whiteout, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would tell him where he was. The wind whipped around him, and Nathaniel pulled his scarf tighter, trying to shield his face from the bitter cold. He had no idea how far he would need to go. The others might be scattered, too far to reach in a single day. But he couldn't stop now. He had made a promise to himself, to Rachel, and to his neighbors. He would help them if it was the last thing he did. As he walked, the eerie silence between the howling gusts began to weigh on him. The storm wasn't just cold. It was suffocating, closing in on him. It wasn't just the threat of the weather he had to face. It was the uncertainty of whether anyone would even be there when he arrived. Was it too late? Had the storm already claimed them? Nathaniel pushed the thought aside. He couldn't let himself entertain doubt. He had to keep moving, one step at a time, toward what he hoped was a rescue. The further he ventured, the harder it became to distinguish the landscape. The trees around him were nothing more than indistinct shadows, their branches bent under the weight of the snow. The path, which had once been familiar, was now lost in the storm. There was no telling which direction he was headed, but he had memorized the routes well enough to know that if he kept heading northeast, he would eventually come across the first cabin. But the storm was not only erasing his sense of direction, it was erasing the hope he had once felt. His muscles were sore, and his face was raw from the constant onslaught of snow and wind. Every inch he moved forward felt like a victory, but with each step his body grew more fatigued. Then, just as he felt the cold begin to numb his limbs, he spotted something. A faint outline, barely discernible through the haze. A cabin. His heart surged with relief, but it was short-lived. The cabin was surrounded by snowdrifts, and there was no sign of life. Nathaniel's stomach twisted as he approached, his mind racing. Could they be inside? He hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. Was he too late? His instincts kicked in. He pushed the door open with force, the wood creaking in protest against the weight of the storm. Inside there was no one. The cabin had been abandoned in haste, the hearth cold, and the remnants of a half-eaten meal left on the table. Nathaniel's heart sank. They had gone. Or worse, they had fallen victim to the storm. The thought was unbearable, but there was no time for grief. He had to move on, had to find the others, or at least try. He stepped back outside, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. Nathaniel's breath came in sharp bursts, his body trembling from the bitter cold. He had been walking for hours, his pace slowing with every step, but the storm was showing no signs of easing. His muscles were sore, his feet numb, but he couldn't stop now. He couldn't go back without at least knowing he had tried. The cabin he had just searched was empty, its inhabitants long gone, or worse. His mind replayed the image of the abandoned home, the untouched meal on the table, the dust on the floor. They had fled or they hadn't survived. Either way, the storm had taken its toll. But he couldn't stop there. There were still other cabins, still other neighbors who needed help. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone else facing this storm alone, unable to escape its grasp. Every instinct in him told him to press on, but his body was beginning to fail him. His steps grew slower, the cold creeping deeper into his bones. Nathaniel paused for a moment, leaning against a snow-covered tree. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He was exhausted. The cold, the wind, the isolation, it was all too much. His body was beginning to shut down, but he couldn't give in. Not yet, not when he was this close. The storm seemed to be growing louder, as if nature itself was mocking him. The snow stung his skin, his eyes watering with each gust of wind. He could barely see anything beyond the immediate surroundings, the white wall of snow and ice surrounding him. The world felt impossibly small, swallowed by the blizzard. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the wind, a faint cry for help. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. His ears strained to catch the sound again, but the wind howled relentlessly, drowning out everything else. He wasn't sure if he had heard it or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But it didn't matter. He had to find them, whoever it was. He had to find a way to help. With renewed determination, Nathaniel pushed forward, his legs heavy with fatigue, but his heart light with the glimmer of hope. The storm had already taken so much, but as long as he could hear that cry, as long as there was a chance, he would keep fighting. He stumbled through the snow, his mind focused on the sound he had heard, hoping it wasn't a figment of his imagination. With each step he thought he was getting closer, but the blizzard made it nearly impossible to tell. The world had become a blur of white, the line between earth and sky indistinguishable. Minutes felt like hours. He pushed through step by step, the sound of the wind howling louder in his ears. His body was screaming for rest, but his resolve was stronger. He could make it. He had to. And then, through the fog of snow and wind, he saw something. A figure. A shadow against the storm. His heart raced as he stumbled forward, calling out, "Hello!" His voice barely reached over the roar of the wind, but it didn't matter. He was close. The figure was still there, and for the first time in days, Nathaniel felt a spark of hope. He was going to make it. Nathaniel's heart raced as he closed the distance between himself and the figure in the snow. Through the blizzard, a man stumbled, barely able to stand. His breath shallow, eyes half closed from exhaustion. Nathaniel grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. "You're safe now," Nathaniel muttered, his voice hoarse against the wind. The man didn't respond but leaned heavily on him. With every step, Nathaniel's body screamed in protest, but the urgency of the situation drove him forward. The stranger's survival depended on it. As they moved through the blizzard, Nathaniel kept an eye on the Quonset hut's faint silhouette, his refuge from the storm. The stranger's weight slowed them, but Nathaniel's resolve never wavered. When they reached the door, Nathaniel nearly collapsed as he pushed it open, bringing the stranger inside. The warmth of the hut enveloped them, and Nathaniel felt his tension ease. The man was still shivering, but alive. Nathaniel quickly stoked the fire, tending to the stranger's needs. His own exhaustion was overwhelming, but he couldn't stop now. He had saved one, but how many others were still out there? The fire crackled softly in the hut, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Nathaniel sat beside the stranger, who was now awake, his eyes still clouded by the storm's effects. The wind raged outside, but the hut felt like a world apart. The stranger looked at Nathaniel, gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. "I thought I was done for," the man said, his voice hoarse. You saved me." Nathaniel offered a quiet smile. "You would have done the same for me." The stranger nodded weakly, eyes closing again. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling fire and the storm's roar outside. Nathaniel's thoughts shifted to Rachel, who still rested in the corner. The storm was still relentless, but they were safe, at least for now. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the warmth of the hut, a fragile peace settled over them. Nathaniel allowed himself a moment of rest. Tomorrow, he would have to face the storm again, but for tonight, they were safe. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the hut. Nathaniel sat by the hearth, his mind racing with thoughts of the storm outside. He had found one man, but there could be more. His neighbors, still struggling against the blizzard, perhaps lost, perhaps too late. His muscles screamed for rest, but Nathaniel couldn't stop. He had made it through the worst of the storm, but he couldn't just sit here, safe, while others might be suffering. He had to try again. The stranger, still too weak to move much, muttered softly in his sleep, but Nathaniel knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. The wind howled outside, still fierce, still unforgiving. He stood, his legs shaky, and glanced at Rachel. She was still resting, but she would need help when she woke. Nathaniel knew he couldn't leave her alone, but the others couldn't wait either. With a final look at the fire, he grabbed his coat and stepped toward the door. The storm was still brutal, but Nathaniel had already faced the worst. He had to try again, to find more people, or at least give them a fighting chance. With a heavy heart, he stepped back into the unforgiving snow. Nathaniel pushed through the snow, the wind lashing against his face with merciless force. The world beyond the hut had become an unrecognizable blur, white, endless, suffocating. Each step felt like a battle against the elements, his legs aching and his breath shallow. He had no clear direction anymore, just an instinct to move forward. The storm had erased the landmarks he once relied on. He had to rely on memory, on the vague hope that his route would lead him to someone, anyone, alive. But as time passed, doubt began to creep in. The storm was taking its toll, draining his strength, numbing his thoughts. What if he was too late? What if there was no one left to save? Nathaniel shook the thoughts from his mind, focusing on the path ahead. His feet were numb, his hands cold despite the thick gloves, but he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going, had to try. The snow was deeper here, and Nathaniel could feel his progress slowing. He glanced around, praying for a sign, some indication that someone else was still out there. But the storm only answered with its endless, deafening roar. He pressed on. Nathaniel's body felt like it was shutting down. The wind had stolen his strength, the snow his will. Yet he pressed forward, knowing there was no turning back. His breath came in ragged gasps, his feet slipping in the deep snow. But then, through the haze of white, he saw it. A faint silhouette. A cabin. Hope surged within him. With every ounce of strength left, he stumbled forward, heart racing. The storm, relentless as ever, seemed to relent for just a moment. This was the chance he had been praying for. He reached the door, knocking desperately. The door creaked open, revealing a figure inside. Another survivor. Nathaniel's legs gave way as relief flooded through him. They weren't alone. The storm wasn't done, but they had made it through together. They pulled the stranger inside, shared warmth and gratitude. Outside the storm still raged, but inside there was hope. The warmth of the cabin, the presence of others, reminded them both that survival was possible, even in the harshest of conditions. As dawn broke, the wind howled, but Nathaniel knew they had done everything they could, for now they were safe. The rest could wait.